We made a couple of errors last week that need to be corrected. The first is this Wallach et al. 2021 paper that we talked about. And Zach, you can show my screen. We mentioned it. Both of us had seen it. Neither of us had read it. And we mentioned on air that neither of us had read it. And we mentioned that what it had found effectively was that the vaccinations for every 3 lives that they were saving, the mRNA COVID vaccinations, for every 3 lives that they were saving, they were actually costing 2 lives, which seemed like an extraordinary result, and it was too extraordinary to be true. And we are all grateful that is the case. This paper has in fact since been retracted. There are enough problems with it. I don't think it's worth going into all of the problems with it.
Yeah, I would just say something. Over the course of COVID, we have seen papers retracted that didn't need to be retracted. In this case, the methodological flaws are real flaws, and so I think the retraction is absolutely warranted. But in any case, people should just be aware of that dichotomy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, we've seen in other arenas, and probably in COVID too, sometimes now basically retractions are a political move in which activists get to the editorial board of a journal and force a paper to be retracted when it really ought not be retracted. We've seen that a number of times. This is not that case. This paper really wasn't good work, and that finding does not hold up. So don't repeat it. It's simply not true.
Actually, I think I know something about the story of how this got retracted, and I will say yes. Okay. I will say I do believe that there was activism that contacted the board, but that their point was accurate, and so to be fair,
if they're activists versus academics who have looked at the analysis and said, wait, this should never have seen the light of day. This shouldn't have passed peer review. This shouldn't have been published. When I say activists, I don't tend to be meaning the people who have actually carefully looked at what was done and said, this isn't good work. The activists may speak in those terms, but they're not actually coming from a place of trying to get the best work out there, even if it disagrees with their priors.
That's true, but I would just point out that we have given people, journalists, I think very rightly, a hard time for the preposterous proposal that the reason that they missed the importance of the lab leak hypothesis was that Trump had voiced some sort of interest in it, and that therefore made it something like wrong. And that's, of course, an insane logical fallacy. I don't even know if that fallacy has a name, but in any case, it is an insane logical fallacy. And the fact that activists put pressure on the journal, which ordinarily shouldn't have any impact. The question is there an actual problem with the paper? Mm-hmm. But the fact that activists may have put pressure on the journal doesn't mean that they were wrong. And in this case, I don't know what they said, of course, but there was substantial reason for critique of the methods in the paper.
No, there should be. Journals should be able to retract papers. It should be a very rare thing that happens, because the more papers a journal retracts, the more that indicates that there's something wrong with the process by which publication is happening in that journal. And I actually don't know anything about the history of retraction here, but I have actually been, I don't know which side of this, in a couple of cases in the last years, I have written into editorial boards of journals who were getting activist pressure to retract some paper that actually just had really politically incorrect findings. And in one case, what I said to the editorial board was, I don't happen to think that this result holds up. Like I can find fault here, but the work itself is careful insofar as it does what it says it does. I would have done something else, but caving to activists when what they're saying is that they don't like it is anti-scientific.
Yeah, in fact, the way this should work in a world in which our publication apparatus was hooked up properly to the system of incentives, you would have lots of things where something had appeared to be true as a result of one methodological approach, and then later on some other methodological approach reveals a third correlate or something like that. Right. You don't want a retraction for every paper that turns out to be wrong. You want actually to be able to track the development of thought that resulted in whatever the current presumption is. But that said, a new paper with a seriously broken method, that should have been caught in peer review. There's no reason that the peers, whoever they may have been in this case, didn't catch it. They should have. The errors are serious enough. But given that the paper was new, given that it was a focus, and given the obvious nature of the critique, it does make sense to retract in this case.
Yeah. And I guess I also want to say, as a way of segueing into the second correction, that we heard pretty quickly from a number of people, both privately over email and to some degree publicly over Twitter and such, that both this and the second thing that we'll be talking about was an error. And it was notable. This has been the case for all sorts of things, but this week sort of concentrated. It was notable how much you could tell about the argument based on the way that they approached us. So I ended up having a back and forth with a professor of computer science about this paper who said, this is not my wheelhouse, but I just did some back of the envelope stuff and this is what I find. And, I went back to her and said, okay, yeah, I see that. And I already know that there are a bunch of other problems with this, but, okay, you say X, how about Y? She responds with Z. And, we were able to do that back and forth, and there was never any, how could you, how dare you, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
And, I think it was an error for us to talk about the results of a paper that we did not read. I am glad that we were careful enough to say
had yet read. I mean, we would have.
Right, but on air, we shouldn't have talked about it. And I'm glad that we said, actually, we don't know, we haven't read this paper yet, but this is what it says it finds. But that, that is an error, and all of the human errors that are made in good faith should be interacted with in response in good faith.
Yep.
So just to say, some people wrote in anger and derision, and in at least one of those cases, I went and looked at what they were saying and said, yep, the point is true, but I actually have no need to hear the message coming in that way because I've already gotten it in the other way. And just know that you will be heard more easily when you are dealing with someone who is trying to get it right, if you also indicate that you are trying to get it right and that there's forgiveness in you. So that said, the other big mistake from last week is this question of the CDC guidelines on critical threshold values. So last week, I said that while I could not find any evidence of what past critical threshold value recommendations were from the CDC for the PCR tests, it was clear from a New York Times article in, I think it was August, summer of 2020, that in general, tests were being run from too high critical threshold value. Thus, and that the effect of that is that you're going to get a higher number of false positives, which would then cause us to think that, the data would make it appear that there are a lot more cases of COVID than there actually are.
So something like contamination could get amplified, so it looked like a signal.
Exactly. And so that's all true. And then I found this undated document from the CDC, which I showed on screen and linked to in the show notes, which I said specified that breakthrough cases, that is cases in people who had been fully vaccinated, not be counted unless the critical threshold value was less than or equal to 28. That last thing, which is what I said last week, is not true. What the document actually shows, and here I'm going to not quite yet, Zach, it's not playing ball with me yet. Here we go. Okay. So this is the document that I showed last week, COVID-19 vaccine breakthrough case investigation, information for public health, clinical, and reference laboratories. And there were two like this that I showed. The other one being this, which is for state and local health departments. This one that's for the reference laboratories has this: respiratory specimen for SARS-CoV-2 sequencing, specimen selection, clinical specimens for sequencing should have an RT-PCR critical threshold value of less than or equal to 28. So that does not mean, if I may have my screen back now, Zachary, thank you. That does not mean that that the CDC is saying, I'm going to confuse myself if I try to explain what it doesn't mean. What it does mean is, given that high critical threshold values, or this is how I interpret why it is what it is. Given that high critical threshold values indicate less signal in the sample, the higher the critical threshold value is, the less of the particles that you're looking for were present in the sample, that is, in this case, less of the actual viral material, sequencing such samples would be more likely to be a waste of time. And what this work is about is looking to sequence these samples in order to figure out what variants they are, what strains they are. And there is presumably very little point in sequencing samples that have so little virus in them that you're not going to be able to get a signal. Now, that, of course, raises a lot of questions. It raises the question of why, if you can't get enough viral particles to sequence above a critical threshold value of 28, why, as the New York Times reported in the summer of 2020, many of the PCR tests were being done at 37 or 40. That is, they had that many more cycles before they got signal. So what I said was wrong, and I'm very sorry to have been wrong. And of course, it's more important that I come back and tell you that what I said was wrong than that I not tell you at all. But I will also say that I still find no indication anywhere of whether the threshold for sequencing samples for unvaccinated people is the same. This is literally the only document that I found that provides any number in this. And furthermore, the links that we put up last week, which went to the CDC site where I found these documents, are now dead. Why is that? Here, I'm just going to show you. So this is, Zach, you can put this up. This is the last week's episode, which I can't stop for some reason. And in the description, we have, as I always do, as many links as I thought to put in here. Where is it? The information for public health, clinical, and reference laboratories right here. They say it's a redirect. Okay. And now, as of 3 hours ago, that just went to a dead screen. And now it's changed again. And it goes to specimen packing and shipping, which is not what it was before. So things are moving rapidly there at the CDC website, and one has to wonder why. I don't know how many CDC sites go down within a week. I think it's suspect that the very ones that I linked to in last week's episode are the ones that are now dead. They both are. So I will say that part of what I was just saying is a big part of why many of you are here. When we make an error and it's non-trivial, we come back and correct it, and we keep digging and we try to figure out what is actually true. So what I said last week about unvaccinated versus vaccinated people having different critical threshold values as recommended by the CDC for the PCR tests in assessing whether or not they are in fact positive for COVID is not true. But it's also true. What is true is that something is being obscured. Something, either intentionally or not. There is, at the very best, a woeful lack of clear communication from the CDC, and it seems like it is likely worse than that.